Hey, greetings everyone. Welcome to the Chapter 9 lecture. So where are we going in Chapter 9? You guessed it. Once again, we are taking the model of supply and demand and we are just using that model in yet another area. We are going to look at another public policy and another kind of area of economics. In particular, we're going to look at international trade and how goods flow across borders. And we're going to use the model of supply and demand to understand how outcomes are affected with international trade and with trade policy. This is another good example of how we can use the model of supply and demand so widely and so broadly. And it's just another example of how we can use the economic way of thinking, right? This rigorous, this analytical approach that we use in economics to just look at a phenomena that we see around us and understand what's going on within that phenomena, within those phenomena. I think this is a cool chapter as well. It's a pretty simple chapter. It's a short chapter, but I think we get a good insight into international issues, and we get even more practice with using these economic models. So let's go ahead and get started. As always, I'll share my screen to my dorky looking notepad. I've got a basic model set up. I'll just remind you, I'm going to use my pointer here. I'll just remind you, if we're looking at a domestic market, just a regular market, nothing special going on, this area, of course, reflects consumer surplus, right? If we're talking about a competitive market with no government intervention, just a regular plain vanilla kind of scenario, this kind of top triangle here represents consumer surplus. And of course, this bottom triangle here represents producer surplus in a regular market with no international trade, just a domestic market with perfect competition and with all those other assumptions that we've talked about: good information, price-taking behavior, no externalities. But now we're going to look at a market with trade, a market with international trade, and in particular where the world price is higher than domestic price. Here, the world price is higher than the domestic price. So this is, remember, this is the supply and demand for a country. Okay, we haven't, talked about international issues at all. I haven't really even said this explicitly, but just to make that more clear, this is just the model of supply and demand applying to the market in one country. I mean, you can conceptualize it different ways, but that's what we're doing. I mean, we're just conceptualizing it in that very simple way. This is just for one country. But then suppose this country were kind of closed to begin with, and so this is the price that we see in the country to begin with before it's open to trade. It was closed to trade to begin with. And suppose this country is like a small country. We're not going to worry about how things happen in a big country. We're just going to say this is a small country, and the country is so small that when that country enters the world market, it can affect the world price. Okay, the world is so big, this country is so small, if it comes onto the international global scene, can't do anything to affect world price. It doesn't have that much influence. So let's say this country opens itself up to international trade and the world price is up here. The world price is up there. World price is obviously higher than what the domestic price in this country would be without trade. But the way you think of it is, I mean, we're just going to take the world price as given. We're so small, we can't influence the world price. We just accept it. We can buy and sell as much as we want to at that world price. So in this case, this is the world price. Consumers are going to buy this much. quantity purchased, you might say. It's the quantity demanded, but it's also the quantity purchased, right? Just read off the demand curve, right? At that price, that's how many consumers want to buy. And that's how many they do buy from the global marketplace. But sellers, on the other hand, at this price, they're happy. You know, they're doing better off. So here's the quantity sold. There's the quantity sold at that world price. I mean, you can see here, right? I mean, if the seller can get this much for their goods on the global market, there's no way they would come back and sell an item for that much, right? I mean, the former domestic price, you know, before this economy opened to trade is completely irrelevant, right? None of the businesses in this country are going to sell for that lower kind of former domestic price when they can get the higher price on the global marketplace. So what would have been the domestic price is completely irrelevant in any way. It has nothing to do with the picture at all now. Anyway, the world price is the only relevant price. There's the quantity that people buy. There's the quantity that people in that country sell on the global marketplace. And what's the difference? Here's a question for you. Don't look at your notes. Don't look at your book. What's the difference here? The difference is, of course, exports, right? I mean, if we're only buying this much, right? If we're only buying that quantity purchased, that lower quantity, but if we're selling that higher price, then obviously we're not selling those additional units domestically. We have to be exporting those goods to the global marketplace to be selling them. So, you know, the difference is exports. And here we can use this model to illustrate how exports come on the scene. Now let me switch to blue. Now what I want you to think about is consumer and producer surplus, right? Consumer and producer surplus is an important part of understanding kind of whether this outcome is good or whether this outcome is bad. So where is consumer surplus, right? It's the same thing as always, right? Consumer surplus is still the difference between what consumers get and what they give up. This area under the demand curve up to the point that they purchase this let me do it with this pointer. This area up to the demand curve, up to the quantity that they purchase, that entire area is what they, this entire area is what they get in benefits, this entire area under the demand curve. And what they give up is this rectangle, that's what they give up in price, just the world price times the number of units that they buy. The difference is up here. That's consumer surplus. The blue area is consumer surplus. Producer surplus, on the other hand, it's still the same thing. Here's this entire box right here is what, shoot, I'm sorry, let me back up for a second. What producer surplus, sorry about this, I'm getting tongue-tied. What producers get is this entire box right here, right? This is what they receive in total revenue, just the world price times the quantity that they sell. This represents what they give up in total revenue. And then the cost that they incur on the margin, again, ignoring fixed cost, the costs that they incur are this area under the supply curve, which is of course derived from marginal cost, as you learned before. The difference is this area, this big area, this whole big area here, this becomes producer surplus. Okay, consumer surplus and producer surplus. So I hope it's easy for you to conclude consumers are worse off. Oh, my writing. Consumers are worse off. Does everybody see that? I mean, the consumer surplus triangle that we have up here is clearly a smaller consumer surplus triangle than it would have been before. Consumers are worse off. On the other hand, producers are better off. Producers are better off. Sellers, businesses are better off. So when we open up the economy to global trade, some people were harmed, some people were made better off. That's very common with any economic policy. Sometimes you'll hear a politician come out and tell you, oh, this policy is perfect and it's going to benefit everybody. That's probably a lie that's believed by gullible people. By gullible people, most policies, have positives and negatives. Trade policy also has positives and negatives. In this case, when the world price is higher than the domestic price, consumers are worse off, producers are better off. But let's look at the net gains. Right, this area here, just look at this part of the picture. Right, this part of the picture used to be consumer surplus, and now it's been transferred over to producer surplus. So that's a wash. That has just gone from consumers to producers. It's this area here, this area that I'm crossing in blue and red together. Right, that area is the net gain to society. Right, that's the overall gain that we've seen. Even though consumers are worse off, producers have more than made up for the loss to consumers. The red part is the net gain to society. Does that make sense? Economists in general are in favor of free trade, and this is exactly why. This is why, because even though free trade hurts some people and makes some people better off, free trade ultimately leads to a net gain in benefits for society. Let's go through one more example. Going through, we're going through another international trade example, but here, world price is lower than domestic price. This is just the complete opposite example that we went through before. This point here would be, that would be the domestic price if this market weren't open to international trade. We're going to say the world price is instead down here. World price. Okay. So here, there's the quantity sold. Here's the quantity purchased. Right, I'm using the exact same logic. I mean, the picture, I don't know why that scrolls down on me. The picture looks opposite than before, obviously. It is opposite because here the world price is lower, but use the same logic to get to those points. This difference, right, here's how much people are selling on the global marketplace, how much these firms are selling on the global marketplace. Here's how much people are buying on the global marketplace. The difference has to be, you guessed it, the difference has to be imports. That's how much, that's the difference between what we're buying and what we're selling. The difference has to come from overseas markets. The difference is imports. And of course, again, the same logic before applies. The former domestic price is completely irrelevant here. Right? If consumers can buy globally for this price, they don't care what this domestic price would be otherwise. This is completely irrelevant. They're going to buy at this cheaper price, period, end of story. This entire huge area, is now consumer surplus. Producer surplus is just this little triangle down here. Consumers are made better off. Producers are made worse off. Same idea. This policy is just like before. It has winners and it has losers, just like most policies. This particular case, since the world price is lower, consumers are the ones who are winning. They're the ones who are made better off. Producers are the ones who are made worse off. Um, again, you can look at how the consumer surplus has changed. You can look at how the producer surplus has changed. The difference is this area right here. This double crosshatch triangle is the net gain. That double crosshatched area is the net gain from trade. Okay. Now, in a lot of cases, you see people who are opposed to free trade. Economists are usually in favor of free trade, as I said just a second ago, and that double crosshatched area, that's why. That is a perfect illustration of why economists tend to be in favor of free trade, because society as a whole benefits because of free trade. You know, the vast majority of the time, economists are overwhelmingly in favor of free trade. But you see some people who are against free trade. And that seems weird. You know, you have people who are winners, you have people who are losers because of free trade. You know, so it's not surprising that people would be against it, but it's oftentimes those voices who are opposed to free trade are kind of more vocal than the people who are in favor of free trade. And a lot of that comes down to this particular scenario. I mean, the consumers, the people who benefit from free trade in this case, are the masses, like just everybody who's in this market. If we're buying widgets, everybody in this market benefits a little bit from free trade. And so the benefits are very widespread. And so nobody's very passionate or very vocal about free trade, maybe in this case. But the people who lose, the producers, are much smaller in numbers, right? The producers in a global marketplace like this, they're much smaller in numbers, and it's easier for them to kind of recognize that pain and to get together and act to raise their voice against free trade, because they're more vocal and the pain is more pronounced for them since they're smaller in number, whereas on the winner's side, it's more widespread. Does that make sense? We might talk about that in the discussion, because that's an interesting point for the whole course. Be ready to discuss. Be ready to discuss that when we get to the discussion on Monday. Okay, I just drew the same picture there. I'm just drawing it over again to have kind of a clean picture. This is a scenario we just did, where we have a country that's open to international trade and the world price is lower than what would be the domestic price. So of course, this is the quantity that people are selling, this is the quantity that people are buying, and this is the amount that we're importing. And of course, this area here, right, this area is of course the net gains to society as a result of participating in the global market, right? This is what we just drew a second ago. This area was the double cross-hatched area in that last figure that I drew. But now suppose we come in, this example is going to be of a tariff. An example of a tariff. The government just comes in and levies a tax on imported items. Okay, the government just says, hey, we're importing widgets over here, we're levying a tax on imported items. And so we're going to assume that with the tariff, it just raises the price by the amount of the tariff. If widgets are selling for $10, government says you have to pay $1 for every widget that you're importing into this country, you know, to the government in the form of tariffs, then we're just going to assume that price rises by that amount. So just to clarify, this was the imports without the tariffs. It's the imports without the tariffs just to begin with. And so this area, this becomes the price with the tariff. Does that make sense? Everything here before, I should have done that in a different color, but oh well. Everything here before was just what we showed in the previous figure. We have the world price, we have the imports, but then when we levy a tax on imports, a tariff on imports, same thing, then the price that we face in this country just rises by the amount of that tax. I mean, the thing is, people who are selling to this country, this is a small country, they're not going to take a lower price, right? They can just sell as much of this as they want to globally. They're not going to take a lower price in a small country because that country has imposed a tariff. So that tariff isn't going to be felt, the burden of that tariff is not going to be felt by global companies that are selling into the small country. The burden of the tariff is going to be felt by consumers who are buying that good in this country. They're the ones who are going to have to pay the tariff. Let me rewrite this. This is the price. This is the price with the tariff. And so this becomes, imports with the tariff. Oh shoot, it scrolled down, it screened down on me. Right, this big area was imports to begin with. Now the tariff has raised the price. Imports have shrunk, right? Imports with the tariff, imports. That's not surprising. That's like, to a large extent, kind of the point of the tariff in some sense. It reduces imports, and of course, it increased sales by the domestic firms. See, this was the overall sales by the domestic firms to begin with. Now this is the sales by the domestic firms, right? The sales by domestic firms have increased because of the tariff. The tariff has benefited domestic sellers, right? That's the whole point. It has benefited domestic sellers. So remember, this whole triangle right here, this whole triangle was the benefits to society of participating in the global marketplace, but now that triangle has shrunk to this amount. That triangle has shrunk to this amount. So this area is the loss in net benefits to society, at least in a preliminary sense. This is the loss based on the tariff, okay? But you have to remember the weird thing. The weird thing is we are now raising tariff revenue, right? We're charging this tax on imports, and so we're raising tariff revenue. And the tariff revenue can be thought of as this box here. This can be thought of as tariff revenue because this box is the amount of the tariff, right, which is the distance between these two prices. It's the amount of the tariff times the quantity of imports. So this box, even though it's kind of a loss in consumer surplus, this is now going to the government, and this can be used to fund, you know, parks or roads or bridges or whatever. So this still has benefits. The true loss is these areas, these little corner pieces right here that are not made up through revenue. These are the net losses to society from the tariff. Net losses to society. Oh my God, that is so scribbly. Anyway, you're taking notes along with me, so you can write that better in your notes. Those two areas represent the net loss to society from the tariffs. So I hope that this little discussion has been beneficial. You see how we can use the supply and demand model in more and more scenarios to understand more about the world. I think this is a really cool illustration of how you can make sense out of what's happening in the world with supply and demand. I think it's super cool. I hope you appreciate it as well. And we can look at a really common public policy, tariffs. Tariffs used to be really common. They used to be extremely common. They became less common But of course, now with President Trump, there's more discussion of tariffs because he's kind of renewed that discussion around barriers to trade. But anyway, you can see their analysis on the impact of tariffs. There's more to tariffs. There are some legitimate arguments for restricting trade. Those are just laid out in bullet point form at the end of my notes, but I'll encourage you to read about those in the book. But this is the baseline. Those examples are special cases. What we're talking about here is the baseline showing how tariffs hurt society as a whole. They help businesses that are competing in export markets where the world price is lower than the domestic price, but they hurt society overall. They hurt consumers. And even more interestingly, I think it was interesting to talk about how why you see opposition to free trade, why you see support of tariffs, even though tariffs hurt society as a whole. It's because of the concentration of the benefits versus the losses there. I will stop sharing. Thank you all. We'll be back soon to talk about the next chapter. Cheers.